Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar for our Urban Forest Management Protocol version 1.1 update. We are just going to give folks maybe another minute or so to join the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, welcome again to our webinar this morning. I see we have most of our attendees trickling in here, so I think we can go ahead and move along into the presentation. Today we're going to be covering updates to our Urban Forest Management Project Protocol. This is version 1.1 of our protocol. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with the Climate Action Reserve, just as a quick update, we are a private nonprofit. We serve as an offset project registry for the state of California's cap and trade program. And we also operate an independent voluntary offset project registry for which we develop different offset protocols. And that's what we are here to talk about today. So before I dive in, just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Sarah Westcott. I'm the Forest Program Manager here at the Climate Action Reserve. I also have a couple colleagues on the line, John Remicall and John Nickerson, who will be able to answer questions related to this protocol update. Just as a quick note, all of the attendees are on mute today. So if you do have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, please submit them through the question box or the chat box in the webinar. And we have plenty of time reserved at the end for question and answer. So I'll get to all of those questions at the end of the presentation today. And then also just as a note, we will be sending around these slides at the end of the presentation. And we will be recording the webinar today, and we'll make a recording available on our website within the next week or so. So just as a note, today's presentation is an overview of our Urban Forest Management version 1.1 update. So we're primarily going to be focusing on changes made to the protocol. So we do assume a little bit of prior knowledge about the protocol going into today's material. But that being said, I recognize that it's been a long time since we initially adopted this protocol, and we haven't been having a lot of urban forestry webinars lately. So I am leaving in a little bit of protocol background for context to today's presentation. So the background for this protocol is that it began in 2007 through our standard work group process. Originally, the Urban Forest Project Protocol was adopted in 2008 and focused primarily on tree planting activities. That was later updated in 2010 to version 1.1, which included a number of clarifications to the original protocol. In around 2013, 2014, we began a new work group process. This was to update the protocol to version 2.0. So this sort of marks a departure from the original version of our protocol, which is the version that was adapted for use in California's compliance offset program. Today, the protocol that we're going to be talking about is purely our voluntary protocol. And through that work group process that I mentioned to update the protocol to version 2.0, we actually ended up splitting the protocol into two different offset protocols. We have the urban forest tree planting protocol, and that is what ended up being 2.0. And then we also have the urban forest management protocol. So today we're talking about our urban forest management version 1.1 update. This update was primarily undertaken to introduce some cost-saving measures to the protocol. To date, we don't have any urban forest offset projects developed or listed with us. So it's our hope that these updates will help bring down the cost of participation so that we can see that statistic change. So while an urban tree planting project primarily focuses on additional tree planting activities above business as usual, the urban forest management protocol focuses on activities that maintain or increase carbon over a baseline level. So this can still include tree planting activities, but can go beyond that to include activities that increase resiliency of existing trees, things like pruning and protecting trees from risk factors, and other maintenance activities that improve tree health and help promote increased canopy cover. For those of you who are familiar with our standard forest protocol, urban forest management is somewhat analogous to improved forest management, but in this case, we're talking about an urban setting. And then also, just as a note, this protocol, again, is distinct from our tree planting protocol and from ARB's compliance offset protocol for urban forestry. Previously, our protocol stated that projects must be located within urban areas, and these urban areas were defined by the US Census Bureau. But throughout this update process, we realized that that was a little limiting, as it precluded some smaller cities and towns from participating in projects. So we've expanded the protocol to also allow for urban clusters, census designated places, and incorporated places to participate as well. We felt that those designations still met the intent of the protocol, but were more inclusive when speaking about urban areas. And today during the presentation, I will still use the term urban area, but just know that I'm using that term kind of generally to refer to all of these different location possibilities. And then in terms of defining project location, our version 1.1 update now includes new language to clarify how projects can reconcile differences between assessor's parcel acres and other GIS sources when defining the initial project area. On eligibility for projects, we have not made a lot of changes. Typically, projects will use the date they submit the project listing information to us as sort of the trigger for a project start date. However, we've also now added in the option that recordation of a conservation easement may constitute the start date. This is in recognition of the fact that urban forest management projects may end up taking place in parks or open spaces within urban areas that may also benefit from a conservation easement to prevent subdivision. We've also recently added in information stating that enhancement payments may be pursued to support project activities. This is consistent with language that we've added into the forest protocol and our grassland protocol. Basically, we don't want to preclude projects from pursuing other grant opportunities that we view as synergistic with the carbon project, as long as the grant is not specifically paying for carbon benefits, as that would get into double counting territory. So this is the type of thing where it will somewhat be subject to our review. We'll want to understand the details of these so-called enhancement payments before approving the project to move forward. Some examples of these are California Climate Investments, or formerly GGRF funds, or US Forest Service grants. This is our perspective on these types of grant programs. We don't have a problem with projects pursuing these to help defray some of the startup costs, and we expect carbon to help fund the ongoing maintenance of the project. But just note that CAL FIRE, or the relevant agency, must also approve these sort of joint pursuits of these funding sources. Our understanding is that the Air Resources Board is open to this idea, but again, we can't speak on their behalf. So that's something that would need to be clarified with all parties involved. Sources, sinks, and reservoirs, or SSRs for short, represent the different areas of emissions, emission reductions, and removal enhancements that must be quantified by a project. We've left those largely the same for urban forest management, but we have added in SSR 14. SSR 14 refers to biological emissions or removals from changes in urban forest management outside the project area. So in other words, this is referring to leakage, which is a secondary effect of project activities. There were conversations that took place around leakage in past work group meetings for the development of this protocol, as well as during the separation of the tree planting and management protocols. And through those conversations, leakage was deemed to be de minimis, which is why it was never previously really mentioned in the protocol. But we felt that for transparency, we should acknowledge the fact that this possible SSR was discussed, was deemed to be de minimis, as we don't expect there to be significant leakage resulting from urban forest management projects. And because of that, we don't require it to be quantified by projects. We have made a couple minor changes to the quantification guidance for this protocol. Before I dive into the specific updates, I wanted to go through a quick overview of how quantification works in this protocol as a refresher, since as I mentioned, this is somewhat of a newer protocol in our program and we don't have any projects actively using it. So I think it bears some repeating here. So like I mentioned earlier, the additionality of crediting for this protocol is first established by creating a baseline. For these projects, the baseline is based on a trend line that we develop across two historical images. The historical images must show canopy cover in the project area, and that's what we use to quantify the baseline tons. The images must be at least 10 years apart and can be no earlier than 1990. And the trend line, which will either be increasing, decreasing, or showing stagnant canopy cover, will be projected for the length of the crediting period, which is 25 years, and then it will be held stable out to year 100. The historical images are used to calculate a baseline canopy cover percentage estimate. This can be done with randomized points or systematic points, like on a grid, using a GIS program. Similarly, canopy cover will need to be estimated for the end of the reporting period, using the same points that we used in the baseline. iTree Canopy is an example of a free tool that we refer to as an example of how someone might be able to calculate canopy cover, but we don't require use of iTree Canopy. It's just one of many options. And then lastly, the project applies what we call ratio estimators. These ratio estimators establish a relationship between that canopy cover percentage that we just calculated and an actual tonnage amount of carbon that has been sequestered in the trees. This is how the project derives its baseline and project level carbon estimates. So like I mentioned, we really base a lot of our urban forest management quantification on this idea of ratio estimators. This is something that existed in the original version of the urban forest management protocol. It's not a new concept, but originally the only option was for project developers to maintain a ground-based inventory of the urban forest and calculate project-specific ratio estimators by directly sampling canopy cover and measuring trees to obtain a carbon value within the project area. This is still an option for projects, but we recognize that this type of inventory is very labor intensive and it's costly, and it doesn't make sense for many urban project areas. For instance, if it is difficult or impossible to monument plots, that can make this process and the verification process very challenging. So the update we've made here is to include the option of pre-approved ratio estimators. These were obtained nationwide from peer-reviewed papers, and we've organized this data into assessment areas. So we have a map and a lookup table, similar to the way we organize common practice data for the Forest Project Protocol, for those of you who are familiar with that option. So this is our map of the assessment areas. Our assessment areas for this protocol are defined geographic regions that have corresponding default ratio estimators. The urban forest management assessment areas include sampled cities and terrestrial ecoregions delineated by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, an intergovernmental organization established by the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. Terrestrial ecoregions are areas of general similarity in ecosystems and in the type, quality, and quantity of environmental resources. Where sampled cities and terrestrial ecoregions coincide, sample cities define the assessment area boundaries and default ratio estimators. A complete list of the assessment areas and their corresponding ratio estimators can be found on our Urban Forest Project webpage. And this table will be maintained and updated as new data become available. For now, the default ratio estimators that we use were sourced from a 2013 study by David Nowak based on ground-based plots and on-site measurements of 28 urban areas and cities across the US. The cities and urban areas in our assessment area table that have been discretely sampled to develop these ratio estimators are referred to as sampled cities. For urban areas and cities that did not have that discrete data, default ratio estimators were developed and scaled by applying the most conservative ratio estimator from those sampled cities into the corresponding assessment area. We plan to consider and accept other studies as new data become available. However, we're starting with this one study for now as it's the most current research available that is consistent with the measurement parameters of our protocol. However, as an example, we may consider data from the US Forest Service's Urban FIA program in the future, or any other relevant peer-reviewed studies. So again, to review how crediting works and also provide a visual, the first step is to establish that baseline trend using historical aerial images, which are used to calculate historical canopy cover. In this case, we're showing a decreasing trend line, but as I mentioned, it may also be a flat trend line or an increasing trend line. This is what establishes our project's baseline. As I mentioned, the trend will be projected out until year 25, which is the end of the crediting period, and then held flat for the remainder of 100 years. Initial carbon stocks are estimated from the current level of canopy cover by applying the ratio estimator to the current canopy cover percentage. This is done throughout the project life for future reporting and verification. So you can see how that will change over time. And then credits are given for the difference between project and baseline carbon stocks. So to get a little bit into the reporting and verification side, on the reporting side, we previously required that all project reports be submitted under the oversight of a professional forester, a certified arborist, or a certified forester. We still do require this if the project is conducting an inventory and developing its own ratio estimators. However, we're not applying this requirement in the case of a project using the default ratio estimators, as those values have already been peer reviewed and we're confident in them. Projects using default ratio estimators do not need to include a site visit during verification. This is another change to the protocol that we think will help reduce costs for project implementation. Instead, the full verification will consist of a thorough desktop verification. Projects developing their own ratio estimators will still require site visits because we require the verification team to check the project's inventory. We've also clarified some language around the timing for verification. This is a pretty minor change. Previously, we said verification was required every 5 years. We clarified that to mean 5 reporting periods. Essentially, it's the same requirement, but is just a little bit clearer in terms of how it aligns with reporting schedules. We've also added in some verification guidance throughout just to reflect the incorporation of this new default ratio estimator option and the assessment areas and how we expect verifiers to be looking at the default values in the assessment areas. Another change we've made is around the timing of compensation for reversals. So reversal is a loss of trees that causes carbon stocks to dip below a level that has already been credited to the project. So if a reversal has taken place, we require the project to undergo verification. In the case of an avoidable reversal, which is basically the intentional removal of trees in excess of what has been credited, we require verification during the next reporting period. If the reversal was unavoidable, which would be something that was due to an act of nature, we would require verification within the next 2 reporting periods to provide a little more flexibility there. Previously, we required that verification of reversals took place within the next year, regardless of the cause of the reversal. As a reminder for anyone on the line who is a bit new to the program, avoidable reversals are required to be compensated for by the project owner. So the project owner would be replacing any credits that were lost. For unavoidable reversals, the program employs a buffer pool. So all urban forest projects do contribute to this buffer pool, as do our forest projects, our grassland projects, basically any sequestration project contributes to this programmatic pool. And it basically acts as an insurance mechanism for credit replacement in the case of unavoidable reversals. And for urban forestry, the contribution is just a flat 6% of credits that are issued. And then lastly, just to really support all of the other changes that I've talked about today, we've published several supplemental documents in addition to the new protocol. So this includes assessment area maps and shape files, the assessment area data file that contains the default ratio estimators, as well as some background information about how we developed the assessment areas and how we essentially came to these default ratio estimators. We've updated our quantification guidance, which is a standalone document separate from the protocol itself. And we've published a project design document template, otherwise known as a PDD. So this can help guide project developers in terms of understanding what information needs to be submitted for project verification. So with that, we have really covered all of the updates that we've made in this version of the protocol. Like I mentioned, this was not a major change from the original version of our urban forest management protocol. The main impetus for this update was to employ some cost-saving measures, namely through the default ratio estimators and the changes to reporting and verification that come along with those default ratio estimators. So I will wait a minute or two. If you have any questions about any of these changes, please feel free to submit them through the question box or the chat box on the webinar. If something comes to you later, this is my direct contact information. You can feel free to reach out and ask any questions you may have about the protocol or our program in general. And again, just to repeat for folks that might not have joined us right at the start of the webinar, I will be circulating all of these slides to everyone that was in attendance. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will post that recording on our website under our presentations page. Okay, so we have one question. Explain how this could get implemented for a current tree planting project receiving grant funding, but also looking to work with you. So as I talked about for this protocol, the crediting is really based on this idea of a baseline, establishing a baseline and performing above that baseline in order to receive credits. So for a project that is already planting trees, those trees that have been planted recently would end up being included in the baseline. That's fine. You know, it's just something that we have to account for as something that happened before the project start date. But that wouldn't prevent a project from enrolling in the program and from continuing to report to us in terms of making comparisons to that baseline. And then in terms of the grant funding, like I mentioned earlier with the enhancement payments, that's not a deal breaker, essentially. We would want to know about the details of the grant funding just to make sure that there are no issues with double counting and that the provider of the grant funding is aware of the carbon project and is okay with it. But on our end, hopefully that would be fine, but it's something that we would want to review to be sure that everything was in line. And then a follow-up question, how is this program getting advertised with eligible entities? How can we support this effort, and do you foresee any obstacles to entry? That is a great question. In terms of advertising, we have sort of our typical routes, which are webinars, speaking at external conferences, and just sort of interacting with any interested stakeholders. So yes, absolutely, we appreciate any support of those efforts. I think getting the word out about the availability of this new protocol is great. And feel free to share my contact information far and wide. I'm happy to speak with anyone who may be interested. In terms of obstacles to entry, I think, at least from my perception, just sort of being the first entity to implement a new offset project type is kind of an obstacle in and of itself. We've had a couple municipalities think about starting an urban forest project under a much earlier version of the protocol. We believe that the default ratio estimators make this version a lot more functional and usable. So we hope that any obstacles that were sort of part of the protocol itself have been addressed at this point, just by bringing down costs. But I think in general, being sort of the first person to uptake an urban forest project is going to be challenging. At the reserve, when we have someone entering into one of our new methodologies, we are happy to be a little bit more hands-on in terms of ushering these sort of pilot projects through the process. So we're also happy to provide more hands-on support to sort of the first couple of projects that come through. Is there a package presentation or high-level overview of the protocol that we can share with potential municipalities? Yes, we do have some other presentation materials that we have shared on this protocol that focus more on a high-level overview rather than getting into the nuts and bolts of the changes made. So I will see if I can share those slides as well when I follow up on today's presentation. Is there a spatial resolution requirement for the images used in the baseline setting? There's not a spatial resolution requirement. We do have a sort of confidence level requirement in the quantification guidance. So in terms of the number of plots essentially that are used, and we do have some general guidelines around using images that are leaf on. And basically we didn't want to include a spatial resolution requirement because we recognized through some of our own testing that some of the older images through Google Earth were not as high resolution, and also are limited in availability. So we didn't want to sort of preclude someone from participating if they couldn't meet that. In general, the higher the resolution, the better, but we recognize that there are some limitations there. Okay, another question suggesting partnering with or reaching out to or partnering with CAL FIRE, the Urban Greening Program, California Relief. California Urban Forest Council and Western Chapter ISA as others actively engaged in planting trees. Thank you for that suggestion. Yes, we are in contact with some of those organizations, and we'll continue to do so at the level that they're interested in sort of speaking with us about the program. I know some of them are aware of our offset protocol, but yeah, it is something that we have continued to reach out to them, and we'll continue to do so. Okay, it looks like that may be all the questions that we have for today. Thank you all for joining the webinar and participating. We appreciate the feedback. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send those my way anytime after the webinar. And I will, again, share these slides, and I will see if I have a more general slide deck that I can share with you as well. Yes, and thank you all for joining.